Good morning, everybody. So my name is Stuart Davey. I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons in our London office, and I specialise in cybersecurity. And I think I've got between about 10 and 15 minutes, and I want to develop upon some of the points that Walter powerfully made earlier about the importance of security and privacy. And I want to do that in three parts. First of all, I want to just take a step back actually and move away from AI and consider some of the cyber risks in the health sector more generally. I then want to consider what cyber means in the world of AI. That's part two. And finally, I want to then talk through some of the things to consider when it comes to scaling AI businesses. All organizations are at risk of cyber attacks and the consequences that follow, no matter what sector they're in. And those risks really aren't to be underestimated. So let's take business interruption. So a crippling ransomware attack, for example, can lock workstations, encrypt servers. It can interrupt business as usual work for days or weeks. And then the management time of dealing with a cyber attack can, as a result, be very significant. It moves management focus away from the normal business activities you prefer to be doing to dealing with what's happened. Just pausing and dealing with cost quickly. Responding to a cyber attack can be very costly. Now, the 2017 NotPetya ransomware attack was hardly your ordinary cyber incident, but it is an illustration of the seriousness, the potential seriousness of a cyber attack. And it affected many organizations around the world, including a number of high-profile global companies in this sector. And the impact on some of those organizations was really severe. It led to the crippling of thousands of computers, laptops, desktops, servers, hundreds of millions of cost, following on from damages, lost sales, resources taken to deal with the incident. The production of vaccines was impacted as well. On the screen here is a chart from a recent annual Hiscox survey. I mean, for our purposes, we can probably ignore the costs themselves, but as a sector, you can see that pharma and healthcare has the fourth average cost. And that's not an anomaly. This is a recent IBM cost of a data breach survey. And again, you can see that pharma is identified as one of those sectors with the costliest responses to a cyber attack. So clearly, therefore, in this sector, a cyber attack is potentially quite costly. Moving on from sort of direct costs, other risks of a cyber attack include the loss of IP, loss of research, the threat of enforcement activity from regulators or data protection authorities. I'm not going to dwell on that in this session, but suffice to say, regulators have robust enforcement powers to investigate data breaches or perceive lapses in cybersecurity and to levy significant fines. I'm sure we're all aware of. There's also an increasingly litigious area, and there is a real risk of legal action, whether that's from a B2B third party or from individual data subjects whose personal data may have been affected. And the latter area is in particular a really risky area, given that individuals have an ability to bring direct legal action for any loss that they've suffered. And that can include just the distress of knowing that their data is being compromised. And that this is a really hot topic, certainly here in the UK, and the Supreme Court is due to hand down a really key judgment any minute now in the case of Lloyd and Google, which concerned the sort of Safari workaround and the use of that and the use of data by Google. And that will determine the ability for individuals to bring sort of US-style mass actions in the UK. But ultimately, all of those risks can also result in harm to your reputation. Now, those risks are real. They apply to every sector, including the health and life sciences sector. But I would suggest they apply particularly to this sector. And why is that? It's because this sector is particularly attractive to cyber attackers. You've got extensive spend on research and development, highly important intellectual property. Personal data is likely to be extensive and sensitive in nature, and individuals trust the pharma industry to protect patient and health data. And of all sectors, yours is one of those that not only is it targeted by cyber criminals who are after a quick buck, but also more sophisticated actors, nation state, cyber terrorists, and so on. Particularly well illustrated by COVID. Authorities in the UK, the US and Canada have issued warnings in the past year accusing the likes of Russia, China, Iran, and others of specifically targeting COVID-related research, vaccine development facilities with cyber attacks. So part one concludes with emphasizing the need to take the risk seriously. So let's move on to consider AI and cybersecurity. Now, artificial intelligence and cybersecurity have a multi-dimensional relationship and a series of interdependencies. But what do we mean? Is it this? No talk about cyber is complete without a hoodie. And particularly here we've got a hoodie with a massive wires to donate AI. Are we talking then about the malicious use of AI to perpetrate cyber attacks? Undoubtedly, AI can be used as the potential to accelerate cyber attacks. It can be used to create more sophisticated attacks and also to enable attackers to preserve their anonymity. But that isn't our focus today. So is it this? Are we talking about the AI benefits in cybersecurity? Are we talking about the ability to use machine learning to thwart cyber attacks? And certainly to stay ahead of attackers, organizations can deploy advanced technologies, and machine learning algorithms can be used to automatically recognize the signs of a cyber attack even before the attack has been launched. And that can involve deep learning techniques to provide protection against threats that are already existing, but also new ones. Data can be fed into AI engines to make predictions for future cases and so on, which in turn can help to create more defensible choke points rather than having to deploy security resources more widely across the entire environment. And it is notable the number of cybersecurity companies that sort of exist in the AI top 100 lists. And it's a fascinating area, but not one that I want to dwell on today. But what I do want to focus on for the remainder of this session is organizations seeking to scale the use of AI to appreciate the importance of cybersecurity. And in particular, what are the particular considerations that they need to use when those organizations not using or developing AI don't need to consider? So this is a typical reference model for an AI lifecycle. It's a generic illustration. And one of the main cyber-related risks comes from the sheer complexity of AI systems. An AI model will be heavily dependent on a number of assets, component parts, more of those assets than are in your typical sort of vanilla IT system. They could be far-flung, deep in the supply chain. So understanding those assets is a key part of appreciating the threat landscape. For each stage of the model, it's important to understand the asset taxonomy. That could include the data, so the raw data, the manipulated data set, the processed data set. And data is one of the most valuable assets in AI, and it's constantly transformed along the life cycle. Walter gave an overview of the challenges of data, and I'm going to come back in a minute to talk about some specific data considerations. But other assets include the models themselves, the algorithms, the underlying code. You've also got the parties, various parties involved, whether that's the data owner, the data scientist, cloud providers, service users, third parties, a complex web of different parties. You've got the infrastructure, the networks, the systems, the tools upon which the model may be based, and the processes for the design, data manipulation, the model adaptation. And getting a handle on those assets, therefore, is vital to understanding the threat landscape, which requires an ongoing review to ensure the asset mapping is kept up to date, no matter what stage in the scaling journey you're at. And then it's important to understand the threats to those assets, which could include the potential loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data within most, if not all, of those parts of the life cycle. It could include access to the model's underlying code, corruption of indices, compromise of the model results, and Walter talked in much more detail than I could at a technical level of model poisoning as a particular threat. because all of those threats could impact upon the safety, the transparency, and ultimately the trustworthiness of the overall model. So I think understanding those assets and understanding the threats to those assets then opens the toolbox as to how to ensure the model is appropriately designed to defend against those threats at each stage of the model. And all of that points to the need to consider security by design from the offset. Now, few IT systems will be as secure if they've sort of been mended ex post facto, backfilling after the event. They'll be much more secure if they've designed securely from the outset. And that applies particularly to AI, given its complexity. I sort of return to data. As we saw, data is a key concern. It permeates all stages of the AI lifecycle. We could spend all this talk and much more on data protection alone. There's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to data protection. There's some pretty comprehensive guidance from data protection authorities. The ICO, for example, has got some guidance about things like data protection impact assessments, the use of pseudo anonymization or full anonymization of data, which can help to address some of the risks that might arise in the event that there is a data breach. But from my perspective as a cyber lawyer dealing with incidents, I think it's key to understand properly the data, because doing that in advance enables you to quickly understand what your notification obligations might look like in the event of a breach. And part of that requires an assessment of the status of each organization involved in a complex AI ecosystem. So who is acting as data processor, who is acting as data controller? And just looking again at the model that the Walter talked through, clearly there's all sorts of questions that arise into each of those systems, the aggregator, the collaborator, as to who is the data controller of the data at any point in time. So companies in the health sector looking to scale up must embed data protection into their culture and processes. Data and security shouldn't be delegated to data scientists or the engineering teams. It needs internal structures for a project or development lifecycle need to embed security by design and data into structures, roles, responsibilities, policies as part of the overall AI governance and risk management strategy. So to finish this up, I want to emphasize the importance of that continued consideration of security by design at all stages of the scaling journey. Why? Because as we saw at the beginning of this talk, the consequences of a cyber attack can be very serious for you, for the individuals whose data you might be processing, or for your partner organizations. Prepare not for the if, but for the when. So a key element of any cybersecurity posture is to have in place a plan to follow if something goes wrong. What do you need to do? Who needs to be involved in that process? And that's something that we can help with. That Roman plume there in the bottom left-hand corner is our incident response solution called Cyturion, which helps to build out a tailored incident response plan, which gets off to a more than standing start in the event that something goes wrong. And we do find that our clients that are best prepared for a cyber attack are those that are then best able to mitigate the potentially serious consequences that might follow from one. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but thank you for listening. That's me, they're my details. That's also a pretty hard to read overview of our global cyber capabilities. And we do have extensive experience across different jurisdictions to help our clients manage cyber risks and to deal with incidents when they arrive. Thank you. Thanks, Nadia.